Hi, everyone. It's Raghu again for Mindrolling on the Be Here Now network. And today is a special day. Of course, every day is special. I say that every podcast. But in particular, having two very old and close friends of mine on the podcast is really something I've been looking forward to. Sharon Salzberg and Danny Goldberg. Hi, Danny. Hi,
Hey,
Sharon.
Hi.
So, actually, this is your idea, Sharon, because we were all together at a retreat with Ram Dass and Krishnadas, Jack Cornfield, Sharon, and Danny was participating. So, of course, it was just after the election, and of course, there was a lot on people's minds, and this became part of the dialogue that we were having at the at this retreat. And interestingly enough, that the topic of the retreat was finding the beloved, touching the compassionate heart. So certainly everybody was very interested in absorbing those ideas and making them practical, actionable rather in our daily lives, considering what had been happening. So actually, and Sharon said we should continue this conversation in a podcast, and Danny should be part of it because Danny has spent a good part of his life involved in understanding politics and all sorts of
okay.
different. Well, you do.
Do you understand politics?
Well, it's not a good way to put it. Okay, put it a better way, Danny.
Trying to understand.
Okay. Well, I always look to you when as the election was
Yeah,
progressing, and we talked at different points, and
I never predicted the outcome, so I
no,
don't
I
know
know.
how wise my remarks were, but here we go.
So the first question is, where were you on that fateful moment, the night before the 8th? I guess we were all watching the results. I mean, I gave up at a certain point and sunk into a depressive sleep. I thought this would be the best thing I could do is to go to sleep right now. So Danny, where were you, and what was your reaction in that moment?
Well, I had the bright idea of inviting about a dozen people over, and I just kind of knew, just looking at the body language of the people on MSNBC, it just was clear to me by 9 or 9:30 um, that Donald Trump was gonna be elected, and I went into the bedroom and never came out. I didn't even say goodnight to most of the people that were guests. Karen Greenberg, my love, had to say goodnight to some of my friends. So I went into kind of a depression and shock. I'm not proud of it because my belief system is to not be so attached to externality. But boy, the feeling of fear, particularly among Muslim Americans and people that are related to immigrants that feel threatened, just felt palpable to me, and I'm still trying to internalize and understand how to balance different things I care about.
Yeah, to say the least. And we'll get further into that. Sharon, where were you that fateful moment?
I was in Barre, Massachusetts, where I vote, where the Insight Meditation Society is. And every 4 years, we've developed this sort of ritual. Joseph Goldstein and I live in a duplex, two separate houses with this shared entryway. And we've been going to watch the returns every 4 years at Joseph's house. So there was a group of us, and I also left early, and I went back to my house, and I just lied down in my darkened living room. And then I went over, I heard people in the entryway leaving a few hours later, and I went over and said, what happened? And they said, it really looks bad. And we had the odd turn of events in that we had people at the Insight Meditation Society on intensive retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done always is every 4 years, we put a folded up piece of paper on the bulletin board, and it says, if you want to know who won the U.S. presidential election, lift this up.
Oh.
So the year 2000 was really odd because people lifted it up and it said, "We don't know yet." So all these people were like really spaced out, right? They've been meditating intensively for 6 weeks and they'd come to see me and they say, "Don't we usually know?" Like the next morning. And we
Yeah.
say, "Yeah, we do, but not this time."
Uh,
So this was another really difficult one and took a lot of processing. It wasn't enough just to announce it. And I heard at Spirit Rock at our sister center, people fainted, people started sobbing. It was
wow.
very hard.
Yeah. And of course, many same similar things were going on at the retreat. A little bit more, perhaps not as dramatic as fainting, but there was certainly tears, and there was certainly a lot of fear in people's hearts, and we did chat about it, and of course, it gets to our. I mean, uh, um, one of the core things that we have to really help each other with, I think, is how do we handle our reactions, our anger, our fear on one hand, and try and straighten out that inner part of ourselves, which is so polarized in this situation. And at the same time, not just sit on our hands. And I know, particularly Danny, you've been an activist for a very long time. We have talked about this before. It is really in gigantic black and white now that we need to address this inside ourselves. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your feelings on how to on that balance.
Well, I think the first thing that I keep coming back to is try to remember the vulnerability that several million people feel right now, and to find ways. Not that I have any suggestions right now to reach out to those groups and members of those groups in particular. I feel I feel that it's important that they not feel isolated and alone. And I particularly think, as I say, of Muslims and immigrants and families of immigrants. Secondly, I think it's worth looking at the history of this country and being really realistic about what this country is. It's had many periods of darkness. It was created with great darkness, with the genocide of Native Americans and almost a century of slavery, and then another century of so-called Reconstruction with Jim Crow and just terrible racism. When we grew up in the 60s, we had a military draft. We had a war where more than 50,000 Americans were killed. We had J. Edgar Hoover as head of the FBI. We had really the birth of second stage feminism and the gay rights movement. Only came late in the 60s, early 70s. My parents talked a lot about the blacklisting period after World War II. I'm reading a book now about Lincoln in the 1830s. People were jailed for writing articles opposed to slavery because it was interfering with commerce. So these dark forces that are scary have been with us for a long time, and there are many examples of people who shone their light in those periods. And I think that it's worth seeing it in that perspective. And then finally, all the spiritual teachings that your network and the people that we love talk about and that Sharon teaches about is to remember who we really are and to not and we can be of most help if we can stay centered and connected to the light inside us and not freak out every time there's a new appointment to this administration that seems to violate the ethical and moral and rational opinions that we have. It's obviously a divided country. There are enormous numbers of people who don't read anything that we read and listen to anything we listen to. And I don't think it's a waste of time to try to see the light inside those people, even if we disagree, with the appointments of the Trump administration. And if public opinion changes, I do believe governments tend to change. And, we have to figure out a way of relating to people that we don't normally talk to.
Hmm. Yeah, that's Sharon. That's so that to me is the biggest toughie in this. Is this polarization and and doing our best to look at a person who we feel has perhaps not been told the truth, and that has a lot to do with what the media is doing, aside from the right wing, and to see them as a real person, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, everyone wants happiness, and it's very much part of what you teach, loving kindness. But boy, it's difficult, as you said, Danny, when each one of these appointees that he's made. I was talking to Lama Tsultrim, just did a podcast with her a couple of weeks ago, and asked her similarly, where were you that night and what was your reaction? And she says, and as it's continued with each appointee, I feel my heart sinking each time and having to go and cup my hands underneath it, so to speak. So it's easy. It's easy to say we need to see the light, but talk about how we really get at the core of this knee-jerk reactivity to what we feel is an out and out. In my part, I just feel like there's so much ignorance, and I can't seem to cut through in my own self, being able to be spacious enough to accommodate a conversation.
Well, I mean, I think there are many, many levels to that. I had a whole discussion with somebody the other day somewhere, because I think ignorance is a thing. You know, sometimes people are taking this to the degree of saying, well, almost like all views are equal and we have to be able to accommodate all views, and this is my view and this is their view. And I said, I don't think that's true. You know, like some views are really biased and they're ignorant and they're hurtful, and some actions are really wrong. You know, I mean, there's no way I'm ever going to say that killing girl babies is correct because it's a custom, you know, or it's the way some people see things, or, you know, racial bias is correct. It's wrong. But, you know, confronting someone as sort of a bad person or an evil person, or to quote your guru Neem Karoli Baba, throwing them out of your heart, is a very different thing. You know, and it's one of the difficulties I find in myself, and certainly in talking to people, is that, you know, the idea of cultivating compassion for someone does not mean you give up the fight. You know, and we think it's one or the other, that either I'm going to have all this hostility and outrage and, you know, probably die young and younger, not young anymore, but younger than I might, and, you know, and fight, or I'm going to be sort of peaceful and mellow and let things be and have, you know, love for everyone in my heart. And it's not like that. You know, well, I come back to like the original teaching of the Buddha, they say, about loving kindness, which was the antidote to fear. And nobody thinks fear is a skillful thing. It's going to help us see options. It's going to help us carry out action or reach out to people that it's uncomfortable to be with. Or remember those who could easily be forgotten. You know, it's like I keep saying, like, I'm 64, which is true, and I see Medicare. It's like right out there. You know, it's like so close. I think, please, not before August. You know, just let me get on Medicare. What about everybody else, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's so easy to think, okay, I'm okay. I'll be okay.
Yeah.
You know, so fear doesn't help any of that process. And so I keep coming back to the cultivation of love and compassion as the antidote to fear, that I need another way of moving in this scenario with as much adversity and difficulty and challenge as there is. And I think, why not take a chance on loving kindness and compassion and see what the cultivation does? You know, I don't really believe in any way it'll make me passive or give up.
Yeah. And I guess there's a way. I think I like what you said about, you know, it's not black and white. It's not, okay, I'm going to be real peaceful and loving to everybody, or I'm going to walk around, you know, with epithets either on my lips or in my mind, which we find ourselves in. I think, I think we got at that a little bit with Ramdas at the retreat, where we talked about it's not like you're going to do this work on yourself and then you will be you'll be a Buddha, and then you'll be able to properly protest and do the activism. But it's do the best that you can while you're in this body and all of this reaction is going on, that you have awareness and consciousness, mindfulness, while this is happening, and you're cleaning up as best you can these reactions while you are doing whatever it is that you can do to protest against some of these really pernicious things that are going to go on that look like pretty bad. I mean, yeah, Danny.
Well, I just think it's important to recognize that anger, racism, war, fear, greed, these are not new things. These things weren't just created on election day or in the year leading up to the election day or in the reaction to having an African American as president. These are things as far back in history as we can find existed. There's no ancient text that doesn't describe these aspects of human beings in this, what do you call it, the Kali Yuga? And I don't know how long a yuga is, but I think it's longer than I'm going to be in this incarnation. So I think a lot of, you and I have talked, Raghu, a lot about Martin Luther King, who to me has just somehow become like one of my teachers, although I never met him. And in his last sermon, he told people, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. And I think we have to, another level of this is to see ourselves as part of a continuum that's not short term. There's this 24-hour news cycle, the internet, the feeling that we have to react immediately, that we have to have a protest immediately. And there are times for protest. And I'm not against protest per se, and I'm certainly in favor of trying to protect anybody who's being unfairly discriminated against or hurt. But this issue is going to go on. It was going on before we were in these incarnations. It's going to go on after we leave these bodies. And there's another level on which whatever we do, we have to do it believing that over time it's going to make a difference, as Dr. King was saying about his life, and that he was not going to live to see the results of what he did. And yet we all today benefit from what he did. And long after we're gone, our descendants will benefit from it. So I think there's a certain syndrome of short-term thinking and the feeling that you have to immediately come up with an answer to everything that sometimes is morally the right thing to do, but sometimes is a trap, and it takes you out of really doing the work of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a pushback a little bit because I happened to see this talk or part of it by Noam Chomsky. Danny,
Noam Chomsky. Yes,
Noam Chomsky, who my mother, it was like my mother's like one of favorite political people or social people, whatever he represents. So I'm watching this thing, and it's called Trump and the Decline of the American Superpower. It's a talk he gave at Democracy Now!, I believe. And it's obviously not that old. It's after post-election. And one of the things he said was, and this is to me the most scary part of this whole deal, obviously. The next generation he said, a next generation has a tremendous responsibility that has not been faced in 200,000 years since the dawn of man. And he went on about just the environmental, structural falling apart that is going on right now. And the fact that it has gotten so out of sorts that in a recent, the climate agreement that happened in Paris apparently has no teeth. There's no enforcement. There's no nothing. It was an agreement of sorts, and they were trying to get some teeth into it in Marrakesh just right at the time of the election. And of course, knowing that Trump was getting in, there was a sense of giving up on every level, trying to get teeth into that agreement. And the weirdest thing that came out of it was that they were looking to China to be that they just discounted America, and that they were looking to China to come up with a plan to lead nations into recognition of the environmental disaster that is portending. And then he went on from there about the lack of water, what's going on, nuclear. I mean, it was a very dire talk, to say the very least.
Noam Chomsky's never been a flower child. He's certainly a brilliant scholar and has been an important voice on the left for my whole lifetime, and I agree with him about 80% of the time. But there's a balance between awareness and despair, and I don't really understand how despair makes anything better. It doesn't seem to me like anything positive comes from it. One thing we know for sure: there are forces in the universe greater than human minds generally can understand. Even MIT professors, even people on the Be Here Now network, and we have to try to listen to those voices inside ourselves and play our part in a cosmic plan that is beyond our understanding. Now, I'm in favor of any pro-environmental idea that I've ever heard, and I hope and pray somehow that the billionaires of the world who have so much power find family members or find inner guidance that changes their course. But we do know that things in history that seemed hopeless happened. I mean, when my grandmother was born, women could not vote in the United States. And I've often wondered, how on earth did they ever get the vote when men had to give it to them? But somehow they did. Again, to read the history of slavery, 20 years before the Civil War, there was nowhere near a majority opposed to slavery, including in the North, because there were all sorts of business people in northern states who didn't have slaves, but who still profited from the slave trade. Somehow this ended. So there have been mysterious things in human history that have overcome darkness. And I just feel that our role is to, in our own lives, do the best we can do, and that doesn't mean closing your eyes to environmental problems. But people have also been saying the end is nigh for hundreds of years. So I don't know what to do about that except pray and meditate. But then I'm not capable of meditating up until I, go into samadhi and pass on to another world. So coming back onto the earth, you do the best you can. And I think that this goes back to the thing of fear, is to try to not be controlled by fear or anger, even to acknowledge it, because we have no other. What's the alternative? The alternative is nihilism. And I'm not into that.
Yeah. But just going back to, though, this little statement of Chomsky's around the next generation has this tremendous responsibility. So, Sharon, how do we speak to and how do we support the millennials and the people that are coming up to be millennials, and the awareness? I mean, my little grandchildren have awareness of what's going on, period. And how do we speak to them in a way that allows them to create some space around not falling into nihilism, as Danny just said?
Well, I agree with everything Danny said. I want to sit at his feet. I thought, wow, that was great. What a great reasoning behind meditation. That's great. Well, I mean, you know how to speak to them because you love them, right? And so in that moment, how old are your grandchildren?
They're 2, 5, and 7.
Yeah, so I don't know how you talk to a 2-year-old, but
79, actually.
but in that moment of love, we find something within ourselves that maybe 2 minutes before we didn't know was there when we were freaked out ourselves. And it's genuine. It's not like artifice or, putting on a show for somebody. It's like we find that place inside of us that is, I think, really exactly like what Danny's talking about. It's hard. We have to do the best we can. We may not see the results right away. We're in this together. There's a quality of that togetherness that is beyond, price. That we can't ever put a measure on. It's so important, and you find that place inside yourself because you love them, and that's what you want them to live with and live by. And so that's one of the great things about service, actually, is that uh, it reunites us with that place inside ourselves that does know, even if it's just for a few moments in that act, and then we're replenished by that. And I can't say enough that it's not artifice, it's not pretending, it's not putting on a show, but we are genuinely connected to something.
If I could chime in on this subject, we also not only need to talk to millennials, we need to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, for those of us that didn't want Donald Trump, if you can go on the internet and see what a map of the electoral map would have looked like if only people under 30 voted. He would have won very, very few states. Would have been over, I think, 65% or some extraordinarily high percentage of millennials voted for Hillary Clinton and did not vote for Donald Trump. And by the way, for those of us that look at ourselves as on the left politically, which I'm not sure is the right path, but it's the one that I am called to for most of my life. In the primaries, Bernie Sanders won about 70%. I have a bias here. I have two millennial kids, 22 and 26. And boy, I would feel that the more that people in the political superstructure and NGOs listen to young people instead of telling them what to do, but letting them guide us, will be better off. There's something about being young that allows you to process things without all of the prejudices and fears that we tend to get when we're older. And it was the same when we were young. During the Vietnam period, you had all these Harvard graduates and PhDs in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who had access to intelligence and far more quote unquote expertise than we did, saying that the Vietnam War was this terrific idea and it was required for our security. And young people intuitively knew it wasn't. And I believe today's young people have a lot to teach us similarly.
Raghu, I remember talking to your niece, Sunanda's daughter.
Yeah, Tara.
And God, I'm trying to think how old she was. Maybe she was 19 or 20, and we were at some conference together in California, and she said to me and her mom, "My generation's going to change the world. You guys just talked about it."
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, turning it over.
Well, here you go.
It's everybody changes the world. I don't know that we're going to see utopia and perfection in our lifetime or the lifetime of our children or grandchildren, but I do believe that for some of the things that we're talking about, such as the environment and tolerance for people of different religious beliefs and sexual proclivities and things like that, that younger people have somehow taken the best of civilization, and they're the most progressive generation. Just really objectively, it's not even close. And it's not that way with every generation. During the Reagan years, younger people moved to the right. But we have a generation of people that have grown up, in an interesting time of the last 10 or 15 years. And I have a lot of confidence in them. They may not have the expertise or the experience, but they have a moral clarity that I think should be supported. I think the best for people that want a so-called progressive vision, I think the more they can speak to and listen to younger people, that's the best chance out of Dodge.
Yeah.
And I think I find, because we work with a lot of millennials here at the foundation. It's the way that it's sort of serendipitously, the right word, serendipitously. It's
Serendipitously, I think.
serendipitously happened that all these people came when Ram Dass said, I'd really like to see that whatever it is I've represented all these years can get paid forward, passed forward to the next generation. So however that's supposed to happen, see what you can do. And as the director of the foundation, I thought, well, okay, I don't know how what do I do? Put an ad or put something on Facebook? I didn't do anything except sit there, and suddenly, literally over a period of 8 months, a year, and in that initial time, which is about 6 years ago, people came to the fore to really support what we've been doing. And you guys are part of the Be Here Now network, which, that wouldn't have happened without these people, period. Podcasts, none of it would have happened. And it's a wonderful twofold thing. On one hand, they're different from us. I remember myself in the 60s and early 70s, my interest in the spiritual path was very self-involved. There was very little. Danny, you were different because you were definitely interested in activism way from the get-go, I think.
I was more into LSD than I was into SDS.
All right.
But I always had an interest in the political world, but I was not attracted to the radical groups because the anger turned me off, even though I was against the war against racism and
Right.
kind of socialist economic ideas. But I was not. My activism came more later on.
Yeah. Well, I just, for the most part, I think that's where many of us were at. Sharon, I don't remember we ever talked about. I think from the get-go, you started practicing meditation, and zip, you went for it. Went to India, and that's kind of what happened with me. I went for it when I met Ram Dass. These people, not only do they have a real interest in pursuing the path and mindfulness and awareness, but they have a real interest in carrying that into an activist pose
Oh,
and
absolutely.
role.
Yeah.
And I think for all of the frustration about the results of the election, I mean, I think we have to be candid about the limitations of the choice that the Democratic Party has given people. I've never voted for a Republican in my life, and I vote for whoever I think is the best person who has a chance of winning. I'm not big on third party votes that won't help anything. But the reality is that I understand why a lot of people are not inspired by what the Democrats have done over the last, during the 16 years between the Clinton and the Obama administrations, because it left a lot of people behind. And there's an orthodoxy to that culture that has to be reformed in order for it to have credibility with the country, at large. And that's part of the opportunity of being out of power is to work on that. And that's part of our work is within our own communities to really look carefully at what's not worked and what's turned people off. Because Donald Trump did not get more votes than Mitt Romney did. It's just that Hillary Clinton got a lot less votes than Barack Obama did.
Yeah. Sharon, in your own experience in teaching and going around, I know that many I keep going back to next generation, millennials and so on, and who they are and how we can help in any way that we can help, looking towards the longer term. What is your experience with younger people related to their interest in teachings that you give, as well as are they opting out of the political picture or of social activism? In your experience, the people that are coming to IMS and so on.
Actually, I wonder if Danny has statistics about. I know that map of if only millennials had voted, but how many millennials did vote, and how many did not, who were qualified to vote, who were 18 or over?
Well, the turnout was lower than what President Obama got when he ran. And I think that there was a decision, decisions made in the Clinton campaign, and I'm sure they thought they were doing the right thing, and I don't envy any of them, and I respect the difficulty of their task. But they ran a negative campaign. They ran a campaign saying Donald Trump is so horrible, vote for us because we're not Donald Trump. And that didn't resonate with some of the young people. And I hear some Democrats saying, oh, it's the young people's fault that they didn't vote. And, I come from the rock and roll business. And when people don't applaud, we don't blame the audience. We try to figure out how to come up with a better song or a better ending to the show so that they will applaud. And that's what these politicians have to do. You don't blame the audience. You figure out how to make them stand on their feet and applaud. And that's a flaw, and that's kind of part of what I was referring to. It's our job to inspire. It's the politicians' job or the public interest group's job to inspire younger people, not waving your finger at them and lecturing at them. How did we feel when people did that when we were teenagers? It's not effective.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to use that thought as a writer. Everyone hates my book. It's not their fault. Must be mine. I think
nobody hates your books. That is not true.
Thank you.
Now, there are people who don't know about your books, and that's a dilemma that we have to face with this complicated media, but your books are wonderful.
Thank you. Young people, it is an amazing generation in many ways. I think there was something of a split in my generation between those people who, not always, but to some degree, between those people who were joining SDS and agitating, and those people who were learning meditation and going to India. Not completely, there are many examples of people who fused them, but I think in this generation it's much more fused. People, well, it's beautiful. It's like an integrated spirituality. It's not something apart from your life and how you treat your partner and your children and your neighbor and your environment. And, instead of seeing it as an activity that you do, and it's really very much part of your life. And I was amazed when I did some of the smaller retreats, like the one I did in the spring with Ram Dass on Maui. And there's a very young person there from Birmingham, England. And I said, what are you doing here? It's a long trip. And he said, it was the podcast. It really changed my life. And there's a young woman there from LA who was brave enough to come all by herself. She was maybe like 17 or something like that. And, what brought you here? The podcast, and they're picking things up and making it real. And I think that vision of a just world, it's natural to them, they know biracial people. They know people with two moms, and it's
right.
A natural world for them. Where for me, it would not have been. It would have been something very, very unusual.
No, the gay rights movement taught the left so much if they would only take the teaching, which is they proved that you could change people's opinions and feelings. That what was unthinkable as recently as the 90s is completely integrated and majoritarian today because they humanized and put a human face and emotions on gays and lesbians. And that was not only great for them, but it was a great lesson that you can change people's feelings by humanizing it. And I think that's part of what we need to do with Muslims. And I think about us in a community that has a lot of Buddhists, a lot of Bhaktis. Most of us were born Jewish. and we quote the reverence that people like Nim Karoli and Yogananda and others spoke about Jesus. And there's still an ignorance, even in my life, about Islam. And all I know is if 1 billion people are connecting with the one God that I believe is present in all faiths through that pathway, humanizing their belief system couldn't hurt.
Okay, how to do that? I actually think it's harder. How do we humanize with and harmonize with the people who demonize Muslims, gay, and LGBT, everybody, the racism? How do we humanize and harmonize and be able to have a dialogue, sit in a room with a couple of people who are completely on the other side of how it is. How can we do that, Sharon? This is up to you.
Well, I mean, I think, part of it is the understanding. People are afraid to do that sometimes because they think this is what I was talking about before. It means giving up all sense of principle, or have to give up your view. And I don't think it means that. It means looking at somebody as a human being and realizing, as always, there are causes and conditions, for anyone's state. And it means listening, really deep listening. Like, what are those causes and conditions? Because it's one thing for two people to come together around a position where they have diametrically opposed views. And it's another thing to reveal any kind of vulnerability, like, I can't afford to send my kid to college. Well, I can't either, or I don't know what I'm going to do if Medicare goes away, um, or, it may not even be as specific as that because not everyone understands policy and its ramifications. But, this is what my life has been like, and this is what has given me strength, and this is what holds me together. And, and not to be in this kind of positional view. I think we can do that. It's not that people are so far from being able to sit in that room, but it, in some ways, maybe the harder step is what happens then, when you have a human understanding and, how do you actualize that into taking action?
There's a book about this that called "Strangers in Their Own Land" by Arlie Russell Hochschild, and she's a lefty sociology professor in Berkeley who decided to spend a couple of years in the most conservative part of Louisiana, getting to know people one-on-one. And it doesn't have answers in a simple way, but it's very illuminating about the shared humanity that she found. And I think that it's one person at a time. There's no question about that. And it's about listening to people, and it's about talking to them. The reality is that our views are formed by a cluster of media that everybody is not accessible. Not everybody reads the New York Times, listens to NPR, reads the books we read, sees the movies we read, and watches television. And there's this whole other channel of communication that gives people a different view of reality. And if you want to know what it is, just listen to one of these right-wing talk radio shows for a couple of hours, and they have a different set of assumptions. And I happen to believe our set of assumptions are more correct than theirs, but I don't think we're perfect. And I think that there has to be some effort made at communicating with them. This is the problem: is that we think, hey, we're in the New York Times, we're on 60 Minutes, these are the peak horizon of our notion of how to communicate with people, and it leaves out half of the country. And if you don't communicate with people and they're only hearing other things, there was a poll done after the Iraq War of people who watched Fox News that I think 65 or 70% of them thought that Saddam Hussein had invaded us on 9/11. I'm a pacifist. I've been against every war in my lifetime. But my feelings about the Iraq War would have been quite different if I thought Saddam Hussein had actually attacked us on 9/11. I knew for sure that he didn't. They didn't. They literally had a different set of assumptions. So, again, this is a long process to figure out how to reach out to people. But there are a lot of people to talk to, and it has to start one person at a time, because they are not reading the things we're reading.
Yeah, that's actually a word for word quote that you're giving us right now, Danny, from Ram Dass, which how that whole retreat ended succinctly was: there's nothing we can do except heart to transmit that love that's deep inside us from heart to heart to heart to heart, one person to another. So, how very true. And and the only thing that gets me through at any point, and I since I'm prone to reactive anger as being, that's my little talk about cause and conditions. And the only way in, I would say for me, is to my fortunate karma and having been with a being who is an example of what we can all be. In this case, Neem Karoli Baba, and to dip into that pool that is fortunately at some point when I can let go of this polarization, of this anger. There's love, which is a shitty word. I mean, Sharon, you've talked about that word before. I love when you once said, yeah, it's not like we're all wimps here. It's love makes you think you're a wimp. But that is the place from which we have any chance at all. Which brings me to the fact that you have a book coming out next year, Real Love. And I think that is the great antidote to many of the issues that we're talking about around polarization, us and them, and everything that this whole situation is feeding into so big time. So just give us a little preview, perhaps, related to being able to, what is love? What are you talking about? Real love, please.
Well, there's a kind of through line in the book. Well, I don't know that I have the answer, I should say that right away, and, I think the struggle or the process or the experiment, the exploration, even the risk taking, in trying to figure it out is the point, and so, there's a kind of through line in the book, which actually came from a movie, Dan in Real Life, which goes something like, love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And so that's kind of the basis of the exploration. I actually got into some trouble with an editor over that, who said, of course love is a feeling, and that's how we think of it, and it's what we yearn for, and that's what we want. And I said, so then I equivocated to something like, yeah, love is a feeling, and it's also, by the way, an ability. Right. Let's look at it as an ability.
There you go. It's not merely a feeling.
That's right. It's not merely a feeling, because if it's an ability, it's a capacity within us that can be awakened by someone else or threatened by someone else, but it's not dependent on someone else, right? It's not dependent on an external circumstance. It's an ability that is flowering or not. And in some ways, that's really the basis of practice, is to return to those perhaps innate abilities and give them a little breathing space and helping unclutter what's holding them down and allowing them to nourish them and come forth. And so in the book, I sort of explore love for oneself, love for an other, whether it's a partner or a parent or a child or a pet or a neighbor or whatever, and love for all beings. And the part that was love for all beings really talks a lot about social justice and what's it like to have a movement that's based on, a feeling of love and connection to all beings. And so, I turned in the book July 31st, and it's coming out in June. And the main editorial comment I got was, you didn't really finish the book. It sort of drifts off. And of course, I thought I finished the book. That's why I turned it in. But I ended it on a story, and I guess it just drifted off, and I could not end it. I kept staring at that screen, and I did end it. Of course I ended it. I would have turned it in if I hadn't ended it, but I couldn't come up with anything else. And my mind went to all these weird detours, just a kind of précis, that was very sarcastic, we've been on a journey together. Remember where our journey began? Chapter 1. And then, and I just couldn't do it. And then the election happened, and I ended the book. It came to me, and it was 2 paragraphs, and it basically was saying, if love is an ability, is it also a responsibility? Right? What's the nature of what I have to grow toward? In this situation where there's so much sorrow or so much fear or so much distress or whatever it might be. That's the end of my book.
I love that. I love that. It's not just an activity; it's a responsibility. That's really great. Oy. This is and this is when I said earlier, what do we pass on to anybody? Obviously, mostly talking about the next generation because of what they really are going to be facing. Aside from the historical aspect, Danny, that you talk about, there is to me a reality that Noam Chomsky is what he's saying is real. I mean that there's a real threat, and young people are really going to have to, be on the mark for it. And
Listen, I agree with that, and I'm in favor of any policy or action anyone can take to reduce the perils of global warming and pollution and environmental disaster. But when we were growing up, there was a real threat of nuclear war. I remember getting these pamphlets about what would happen with a 5 megaton bomb dropping in New York, and how many people would die within a 1 mile perimeter and a 5 mile perimeter and the fallout shelters. Other generations have dealt with a sense of apocalypse, hatred, disaster, and fear, and it's worth learning from how they got through it, because otherwise the danger of the Chomsky rhetoric is it can become nihilistic, and just I want to feel it connected to, okay, what do we do?
Yeah.
What do we do? And I admire him, but not unreservedly.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I'm just I think what the love is an activity and a responsibility, and being able to engender that with those that are really going to be facing very, very tough times well beyond our lifetime, I think is super important. And I just didn't want to make light of that. In regards to the reality that this is not new. These things, as you say, have been going on forever.
Well, the only way to change these gigantic, selfish, dark institutions is to change enough public opinion that it actually moves the needle. And we now know a simple majority is not enough. So in order to change things, we have to relate to people who don't listen to Noam Chomsky. We have to radiate to a broader group of people. And that I hope that some of the energy that's now being spent in protest can also be transmuted into persuasion and communication with a wider group of people, because otherwise there's a certain self-indulgence to mere anger and protest.
Yeah, right. Exactly how we started talking about this, and the balance between social activism and inner work. And by the way, this hasn't been, I don't even know, Danny, we'll see how you feel about me announcing this, but since Sharon's book is coming out in the spring, actually, this is crazy. I'm just realizing. Sharon, your book's coming out in June 1st, Real Love.
June 6th, yeah.
June 6th,
Mine is also coming out on June 6th.
Really?
Yes.
You have a book coming out. Oh,
yeah,
tell me.
and guess what it's called?
Yes. It's called In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the hippie idea.
The Summer of Love.
This whole thing about looking to history, I admit, has been informed by, I've spent the last 6 months of my life living in the past. But there are some differences and there are some similarities.
Oh, it's thrilling. I'm so excited.
You know what we're going to do on the Be Here Now network and in our store? We'll blister pack the two books together on the 6th. Okay, Danny and Sharon.
I am not worthy, but I'll take it. And by the way, I couldn't finish my book either until after the election.
Oh, interesting.
It's a funny thing. I was really trying to figure out how to end it, and then it came to me in the weeks after the election. I don't want to. I just have one line that reflects the current moment, because it's not about the current moment. Yeah. It's about 50 years ago. But somebody put out, there's a Facebook page called 50-year Anniversary of the Summer of Love, and someone put online, who cares about 50 years ago? There's problems today. Why should we care about the Summer of Love? And I just wrote, love is beyond time.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Love is beyond time. I like that. Maybe we're going to call we're going to call that this podcast.
The blister pack?
The blister pack, yeah. God, thank you guys so much for hanging here with
Thank
us.
you. This is
This
wonderful.
is
I'm so excited
delight.
about your book. I'm thrilled.
Oh,
Yeah.
and I about yours.
So
Uh,
All
great.
right. Thanks,
and
Raghu.
yes, and of course, everybody listening, you guys can listen to both Sharon and Danny on the Be Here Now Network, and go to BeHereNowNetwork.com. And we have a host of other wonderful offerings aside from the podcast, all beautiful articles and videos and the Heart Mind app. We got it all going. So we shall see you next time on Mind Rolling on the Be Here Now Network. See you guys.
Later.
Bye.